Hello again guys, welcome back to the channel. In today's video we have yet another aircraft review. This is one that I'm sure has been highly anticipated by many of you. It is of course the Aerosoft CRJ. Of course the CRJ is the first real civilian jet that we've had developed by a third party for Microsoft Flight Simulator. And I think that many of us are hoping that the CRJ will usher in a new era within the sim, where we start to see third-party add-ons bringing with them more complexity, fidelity and ultimately realism. So the aim of today's video is to put the aircraft through its paces and to see to what extent that holds true. The route that we'll be flying today is provided by Aerosoft in their tutorial documentation, and we'll be taking the aircraft from Paderborn over to Munich. For many of you the route may well sound familiar. If you've seen any of the CRJ preview materials created by The Dude on YouTube, you'll know that he carried out the exact same routing. This particular video is very much designed to be a review and not a tutorial, but if you do want an incredibly professional and thorough breakdown of how to operate the CRJ, then I highly recommend going and checking out his channel. I'll leave a link down in the description. As usual for today's review flight, we'll first take a look at the external model of the aircraft. We'll then take some time to head inside and take a good look around the cockpit. After that we'll carry out our flight with a full startup of the CRJ. We'll make our way over towards Munich, fly the ILS in for runway 26 left. We'll park up in Munich, shut down the aircraft, and I'll then give you my overall views of the add-on. A little bit of a warning now, my breakdown at the end will be quite lengthy in this video. Firstly, the CRJ is somewhat experimental in nature, and as a result there are quite a few issues that will need mentioning there. Also, of course, the aircraft is a complex jet, so there'll be plenty to talk about. It's probably also worth prefacing this review by stating that, of course, I'm not a real-world CRJ pilot, and so many of my opinions throughout this review will really be based around either educated guesses or my general experience. Similarly, I've tried my best to learn the CRJ procedures for the review, but of course with the aircraft being rather complex, I'm sure there are certain areas where mistakes might be made, and I'll apologise in advance, but I'm sure a few Airbus isms are going to creep in as well along the way. Anyway guys, as always I do hope that you enjoy the video and find it useful. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me, please leave them down in the comments section below. But now let's continue with our tour of the Aerosoft CRJ. So beginning as usual with the external model of the aircraft. And as you can see, overall Aerosoft have done a very nice job of recreating the CRJ. Overall the proportions of the jet look good, and certainly there's enough visual detail there to give the aircraft a convincing model. I think it would be fair to say though that the external model of the Aerosoft CRJ is nothing revolutionary. It's certainly not the best example I've seen of modelling within the sim to date. Generally speaking, quite a few areas on the aircraft are fairly low in terms of modelling depth and resolution. You can see that with the nose landing gear and the main landing gear for example, that the level of modelling depth is certainly not up to the standards that we've seen on some of the other new additions to Microsoft Flight Simulator. And the same goes for some of the aircraft's curved edges and surfaces. You can see a few jagged edges here and there. You'll only really notice these blemishes though if you get really up close and personal with the aircraft. Even zooming out at a reasonable level you can see that actually the visual model holds up quite nicely. I would assume that some of the sacrifices in modelling fidelity, particularly on the external model of the aircraft, were a conscious choice by Aerosoft to help try and keep the CRJ's overall frame rate impact down. Once again, as aircraft get ever larger and more complex within the sim, we are going to see more of a frame rate impact, and of course reducing the level of modelling detail in some of the aircraft's more hidden away areas is one way of helping to mitigate that frame rate hit. For me personally, I don't mind in the least if the external model of the aircraft is done to a lower fidelity than the internal model, as I'm someone that generally spends all my time in the cockpit anyway. But if you are someone that values every nut and bolt being modelled in exacting detail, then these points may well be of interest to you. So that just about covers the external model. As I said, overall a pretty nice job from Aerosoft. They've certainly managed to make a convincing model of the CRJ, and from a reasonable distance the aircraft holds up very nicely and looks really good. Where the aircraft really shines though is when we come into the cockpit. As you can see, Aerosoft have done an absolutely wonderful job with the cockpit of the CRJ. And so we'll just take a little bit of time now to look around the cockpit in a little bit more detail. Overall, I have to say that I really struggled to find too much to fault in the internal modelling of the aircraft. The cockpit is modelled to an absolutely brilliant standard, and all of the texturing looks really nice as well. The displays as well look really nice. I think that Aerosoft have managed to create a really nice effect with those. For some reason, by default, you're sat very far back in the cockpit and quite zoomed out, and at those sorts of distances the displays can be a little bit tricky to read, but once you get yourself set up properly in the cockpit you shouldn't have any issues. Unlike with the external model, even some of the more hidden away areas in the cockpit are still done to a very exacting standard. Even coming down to the footwell and the rudder pedals, as you can see, really nice modelling and texturing there. Even some of the more obscure systems in the cockpit seem to be fully functional. For example, the refueling panel seems to work correctly. And I have to say, in terms of normal operation, I didn't find any switches or controls that weren't clickable and operable. Aerosoft do generally market their aircraft such that they're only modelled to a day-to-day operational standard. Essentially, all the normal systems will work correctly, but anything you might use in an emergency or an abnormal situation may well not be modelled. But as I say, certainly everything I needed for the flight today seemed to be fully functional, and I was actually really impressed with the level of systems modelling, as well as the amount of depth and fidelity given to the flight management system. As I say, I think that the CRJ's cockpit is really its ace up its sleeve. I think that Aerosoft have done an absolutely lovely job with both the modelling, texturing, systems depth and the overall ambience on the flight deck. Anyway, of course it's all very well knowing that the aircraft looks very pretty, but what we're really interested in is to find out for ourselves how well the aircraft actually flies. So in that vein, we'll get ourselves sat down and we'll get the aircraft started up. So like most new add-ons within Microsoft Flight Simulator, the Aerosoft CRJ comes with an onboard EFB. As you can see, we have a variety of options available. We have a checklist section with a full set of very comprehensive checklists for operating the aircraft. We have a performance tab which allows us to set up the aircraft's weight and fuel load. We can either set a 0 fuel weight and a fuel, or we can change across and set various passenger numbers, cargo loads, things of that nature. Below that we get a mini load sheet giving us all the pertinent data for the aircraft. We have a few options to set the payload in the simulator, copy the data straight into the FMS, which is a really nice feature if you just want to get going. Next to that we have a CFG and weight limit chart, which allows us to see instantly our position within the aircraft's current CFG and weight, and of course then we can check that the aircraft will be within limits throughout the flight. Next to that we have our takeoff calculator. We can choose between flaps 8 or flaps 20 for the takeoff. We can set various conditions and that will calculate for us all of our various V-speeds for the takeoff. We can set those manually or we can hit set all and that will load them straight into the aircraft for us. Again, a very nice feature to have. And we have the same feature for the landing speeds as well. Moving across we have our aircraft options. Here we can set up various options for the aircraft configuration on the ground. So for example, we can select chocks, we can connect to ground power cart, we can open various doors, adjust the cabin lighting, and also we can select various aircraft states. So as you can see we have cold and dark, turnaround state, ready for start, ready for taxi. It's a really nice option to have. I have found that when we load the aircraft in from the main Microsoft Flight Simulator menu, that the aircraft loads up in a little bit of a strange state. So for example, the engines are running but don't seem to be working for me when I load the aircraft in initially. So you might find that you'll have to select one of these states before you actually get going. We have a maintenance section with some very limited maintenance options, but again nice to have. We can stow the AGG, we can reconnect the IDGs, we can stow the passenger oxygen, refill the crew oxygen, and reset our brake temperatures. So there obviously are some minor systems abnormalities modelled within the aircraft, and we can reset those accordingly, which is again nice to see. Lastly, we have our options menu. This primarily allows us to select various configurations for the aircraft. For example, we can select the units of weight and temperature that the aircraft is displaying in. We can select our barometric units as well. We can select our different flight director styles, our IRS align time. Another nice feature we have is a throttle position prompt on the PFD. I believe that's not realistic, but it allows us to see, given that obviously in the real aircraft you'd have much more tactile feedback from your throttle. We have 2 pages in the options menu, and as you can see there's various other options that we can select on the aircraft. Anyway, that's the current full functionality of the Aerosoft EFB. I'm sure many of you were hoping to see things like updated live METARs and the option to display real-world charts in the EFB. Unfortunately though, that's not currently possible, essentially due to the way that the aircraft talks with the sim. The Aerosoft CRJ is actually using a new method of modelling and interfacing with Microsoft Flight Simulator, so as a result currently those sorts of things can't be implemented, but Aerosoft do state that at a future date they would like to of course introduce those features. Overall though, still quite a comprehensive EFB and a really nice feature to have on the aircraft. So welcome to the cockpit of the Aerosoft CRJ 700. We're pretty much ready to go here. We've just pushed back off the stand here at Paderborn. We have been cleared for the start, so we'll run the before start checklist. So personal electronic devices are off, APU is on, electrics. So we'll come down to the ECP, we'll select the electrics page. You can see that the APU is currently carrying the load for the aircraft's entire electrical system. So AC electrical systems look good. We'll hit elect again. And the DC electrical systems look good as well. Takeoff data has been set. Doors. So again, coming down to the ECP, and you can see all the doors are closed and locked. Beacon is on. Fuel pumps and fuel quantity. So fuel pumps are on, and fuel quantity we're showing 3,390 kilograms, which is what we require for the flight today. Hydraulic pumps are auto and on, and the parking brake is on. So that's the before start checklist complete. We are cleared for the start. We'll start the right engine first. To do that we just come up to the engine panel, we'll hit right engine start. You'll hear the air conditioning drop offline there as the bleed air from the APU is used to spool up the engine. And you can see that the N2 stage of the engine is spooling up. Waiting for 20% N2 until we introduce fuel. So disconnect the thrust lever lock and move the thrust lever to the idle position. And you can see by doing that we introduce fuel into the engine, we get a rise in fuel flow. N1 starting to spool up now, we should see a rise in ITT momentarily, which we now have. Oil pressure's coming up as well. And just continuing to monitor the engine parameters as it spools up. Waiting for the engine to stabilise around 21% N1. And the engine is stable, so we'll start the left engine. So the starter is engaged. And again, N2 spooling up. Once again waiting for 20% N2 before we introduce the fuel. And just coming up on 20%. So moving the thrust lever into the idle detemp once again. And we have our rise in fuel flow. M1 spooling up. There's our rise in ITT. And again, just waiting for the engine to stabilise. Oil pressure's in the green. And the engine is stable, so we have two good starts. So we'll run the after start checklist. Generators are checked auto. Electrics. Again, checking the aircraft electrical page, you can see that the engine driven generators are now picking up the load for bus 1 and 2. And again, the DC electrical system is checked. Bleed valves are auto. Packs are on. APU can come off now. So we'll hit the APU stop button. If we go back to the status page, you can see that the APU is starting to run down. So we can cut the power and the fuel to the APU as well. Anti-ice is not required for the flight today, but we'll take the window heat and the probe heat. And the nose wheel steering is in the armed position. Taxi checklist. So slats and flaps, say flaps 8 takeoff today. So there's flaps 8 selected. And waiting for the flaps to run out. We have flaps 8 indicated. Flight controls. So again, coming down to the ECP, we'll select the flight control page. Do a quick flight control check. It says full up, full down, neutral, full left, full right, and neutral, and the rudder, full left, full right, and neutral. So flight controls are checked. Trim. So for the takeoff trim setting, we're coming down to the performance page, looking for the trim of 7.2 units today. I have found that occasionally you introduce some issues by not entering this data in a very specific order, so I'll just hit set load in simulator again. You'll see that's actually corrected the load now on the aircraft, and we're now looking for a trim of 6.5. It's a little bit of a bug there. Basically, if we don't enter this in exactly the correct order, which from memory basically we want to enter the zero fuel weight and the fuel, hit load in simulator, and then copy data to FMS. That's now giving us the correct trim of 6.5 units, so we'll set that. And the trim is green, and the rudder and aileron trims are checked. So trims are set, thrust reversers are armed, flight instruments are checked, and the brake temperatures, not going to be an issue today, it's the first flight of the day, but the brake temperatures are checked. So we are now ready and cleared for the taxi. The taxi light can come on. It's all clear on the right, and all clear on the left. Park brake off. I find the aircraft doesn't really like to get moving under its own power, so we'll just have to come up a bit on the thrust to get the aircraft underway. And we'll start swinging around to the left. Similarly, in the turns, the aircraft does need quite a bit of thrust to keep it moving. And I find as well, if we use full nose wheel steering deflection, the aircraft has a bit of a tendency to stop turning, so I find it preferable to use just slightly below full deflection. Not sure if that's realistic or not. I suspect not. That may be an issue with my control calibrations, to be fair. So as I say, just swinging the aircraft around, we'll join the taxiway straight ahead of us. All clear out on the left. And as you can see, the aircraft does need quite a bit of thrust initially. We're using about 40% N1 at the moment, which I believe is right around the limit of what we can actually use on the ground in the CRJ. Still clear on the left, taking the next right to join the main taxiway, and then taxiing all the way down to the holding point for runway 24. Once you have the aircraft speed up, though, it actually maintains its taxi speed very nicely, even at idle thrust, so that's quite good to see. As I say, we're now to just taxi straight ahead all the way down to the threshold of runway 24. For the departure brief, it's straight ahead initially and then a left turn. And we currently have 5,000 pre-selected on the PFD. So we'll start running the before takeoff checklists. So lights and strobes, we'll turn those on once we enter the runway. Fuel cross flow goes to manual. It's now in manual. Flight attendant will advise them shortly. Transponder is auto and TCAS. Radar and terrain display, we'll leave those off for the flight today. Unfortunately they're not currently modelled in the sim. Again, I believe that's just an interfacing issue between the sim and the aircraft currently. And the CAS. So we have takeoff config OK, left and right reverse are armed, manual crossflow, and the seatbelts and no smoking signs are on. Just box the CAS messages there by hitting the status once again on the ECP.
The captain has advised that we are now cleared for takeoff.
You can hear that the flight attendant has just advised the passengers of takeoff, so they have been advised. And that's the before takeoff checklist complete. Just slow the aircraft down slightly as we join onto the runway. We'll assume we have been given takeoff clearance. So landing lights and strobe light can come on. It's runway 24 confirmed, it's clear on approach. Just coming up slightly again on the thrust just to keep the taxi speed up. Don't want to be on the runway any longer than we have to be. And again, runway 24 confirmed. So we'll momentarily come to a stop at the threshold. So in real life on the aircraft we want to hit the toga switch on the thrust levers. That will engage the correct flight director modes and I believe also give us a position update in the flight management system. In the Aerosoft CRJ, however, we can also hit the top left screw here on the autopilot FCU, and that will do the same thing. Quite a nice feature to have in case you don't want to be looking down here just at the last moment. So we'll hit the screw, that gives us takeoff on the FMA. And we now have the flight directors as well on the PFD. Come up to 50% N1, wait for the engines to stabilise. You can see we do have a little bit of a crosswind out from the right, around 10 knots. So the engines are stable. Takeoff. It's a flex takeoff today, so we'll come up to the toga detent on the thrust levers. There's toga. Thrust is set. A little bit of right aileron just to counter the crosswind there. It's 100 knots. Needing quite a lot of right aileron there to counter the crosswind, and now quite a lot of left rudder as well. There's V1, rotates. The nose actually coming up of its own accord there, which I suspect is not realistic. And we'll pitch up to around 20 degrees to maintain V2 plus 10. It's positive climb, gear up. And trimming the aircraft. Yeah, so the aircraft behaved a little bit strangely there on the takeoff. I think the wing was picked up a little bit too much by 10 knots of crosswind. And then, as I said, the nose as well picking itself up at rotate speed, which I suspect is not realistic. Anyway, we're through 1,000 feet now, so we'll go speed and nav. Engage the autopilot. Come back to climb thrust. We'll start accelerating up to 250 knots. And we'll assume we have been given further climb by air traffic. So we'll climb up to flight level 110. Speed's coming up so we can retract the flaps. And we're clear of any cloud for now, so we're clear of icing for the moment. Just keep the speed back slightly actually for the turn. Come back to around 220 knots for now. Of course, the lower our speed, the easier it is for the aircraft to maintain its turn radius. And the climb checklist, fuel cross flow. Can go back to auto. Bleeds and APU are set. Just got a master caution there. Suspect that's for a little bit of icing. Pass through transition level as well, so we'll set standard on the altimeters. And that is standard set and cross-checked. Sure enough, we do have an ice caution, so we'll turn the engine anti-ice on. Thrust reversers can come off, and the CAS. Just got the CAL anti-ice message there. CAS is checked. That's the after takeoff checklist completes. So just coming around in the turn, as you can see. And now that we've made our turn, we'll start accelerating again up to 250 knots. So there's 250 selected on the speed, and we'll assume we'll be given again further climb by air traffic, all the way up to our cruising flight level now of flight level 290. And we have 290 set, so the autopilot should now capture that. So overall the aircraft doing a very good job there of managing the climb and the departure in terms of the autopilot modes. As I said, I think the takeoff behaviour was a touch strange there, both in terms of the wing being picked up by just 10 knots of crosswind. Quite a lot of left rudder there as well needed to counteract for that. And as I said, the nose coming up of its own accord at rotate speed there seems pretty unlikely to me. But again, I've not flown the real aircraft. It may be that the aircraft does have a tendency to do that. But again, I suspect not. So just approaching 10,000 feet. We'll wait until we pass through 10,000 feet and then we'll accelerate up to 300 knots for the climb. There's 10,000 feet. Landing lights can come off. Speed, as I said, we'll select 300 knots now. And the weather's pretty benign outside, so we'll cycle these signs, let the cabin crew start doing their work. So aircraft now accelerating up to 300 knots. As you can see, the vertical speed's reduced there. We'll display the flight plan information on the navigation display. So you can see that we now have a selection of waypoints and the destination. That's giving us our distance to run, our time to run, and our expected fuel on board at arrival. Overall, I have to say all of the systems that I've seen so far from the Aerosoft CRJ seem really thorough, really nice job done from the team there. Again, I'm not familiar with the real aircraft, but certainly the vast majority of the functionality seems to be there, which is really nice to see, and there's certainly more than enough to carry out a flight very effectively in the jet. So welcome back to the flight deck. As you can see, we're about 20 miles away from our top of descent currently, still maintaining flight level 290 at the moment, and a speed of about 280 knots, Mach decimal 74. Important to remember in the CRJ that the thrust levers are actually completely manual. There's no auto thrust on the aircraft, so very important to remember when you get to top of climb that you do have to control the thrust manually, but I think that's a really nice thing about the jet. It does make it a lot more hands-on. Anyway, we'll start setting up for the arrival into Munich. We're expecting the Anora 3 Alpha departure for runway 26 left, which is what we have set up in the flight plan. Coming in from Anora and then tracking out towards Mike, India, Quebec. and then from like India, Quebec, we'll basically vector ourselves onto the ILS runway 26 left. I believe that the flight management system does actually auto-tune the ILS in the real aircraft, but I've just manually tuned it today just to be on the safe side. So for the arrival we're looking at plate 60-20, and for the ILS itself we're looking at plate 7-50. As I said, the ILS is 108.3, the final approach track is 261. Aerodrome elevation is 1487, and we have the landing elevation set. There's a profile check at 11.1 DME of 5,000 feet, and we're down to an MDA today of 1670, which we have set on the PFD. If we need to carry out a missed approach, it's basically a left turn at 1 DME, climbing up to 5,000 feet. In terms of terrain, there is some high terrain out to the south of Munich. The MSA for the arrival is 3,700 feet. Well, it's much the same as it was in Paderborn, just a little bit of low cloud around and fairly cold conditions. Landing on 26 left, as I said. For the landing we'll use idle reverse. There's no auto brake in the CRJ, so it'll be manual braking. Vacating off to the right. The alternate for our flight today is Stuttgart, and we need 1.4 tons of fuel for Stuttgart. You can see we're currently arriving into Munich with about 2.1 tons, so we'll have about an extra 700 kilos on the arrival should we need it. So for the descent checklist, the landing elevation is set. Fuel, we have 2.4 tons checked and balanced. TCAS is set to below in preparation for the descent. Radar will leave as is. CAS is checked, just the no smoking signs at the moment. Landing data, we can insert that now, so to insert that we go to performance and we can just hit set all, and that will set the appropriate speeds for the arrival. Approach briefing has been completed, so that is the descent checklist complete. We've just reached what I calculated to be our top of descent, but we'll use the aircraft's calculated top of descent. Our first restriction, as you can see, is to be below flight level 250 at waypoint Anora. So we'll get the aircraft coming down now. We'll set flight level 250. And we'll just use VS for the descent. So there's VS. And we'll set VS minus 1000 for now. So there's VS minus 1000 with flight level 250 set. So all the way back on the thrusts. Might need a little bit of speed brake here as well. So I'll take the speed brake just to make sure the speed's back at 280 knots at Buram. And just coming on one to go, so we're about on profile at the moment. It's max 280 at Buram, so we'll let the speed fall back just a little bit before we get rid of the speed brake. There's the speed brake. And we can start easing off again on that descent rate now, as we're just past our restriction at Buram. 15,000 feet, which means we need about 45 miles to run. We've got 49, so we're a little bit low now, but that's just the profile of the arrival putting us low. Come back to 2,000 feet a minute for now. Start coming up again on the thrusts. Get the seatbelt signs on. Take the engine anti-ice as well. Just as we come back into this cloud layer. And around 11,000 feet we'll start reducing our speed back to 250 knots. Coming up on the thrust again to maintain 280 for now though. Keep reducing that vertical speed. A little bit tricky to see the PFD in these lighting conditions. Really coming back up on the thrust again now, just drop the speed there a little bit. It's a little bit hard to feel where the thrust levers are, as the position of my throttles is significantly higher than the position currently showing on the thrust levers, so it feels like I've got a lot more thrust on than I actually have. There is a method of calibrating the thrust levers via the EFB, so I might have to try that at a later date. Speed coming off again now though. So just coming up from 12,000 feet, which means we need about 36 miles to run. Currently showing 39, so again just a touch low at the moment, but that's fine. But localizer will be tuned, so again I think the aircraft does actually tune that automatically for us, but we'll leave it in. As I say, we'll leave things managed ourselves for now. So we've got 1083 in manual. So just starting our turn out towards the east, that's going to put us on a right hand downwind for runway 36 left. And we're just coming off on 11,000 feet now, so we'll start bringing the speed back to 250 knots. There's 250 selected. We'll reduce our vertical speed. And we'll come back on the thrust levers as well. Centre up our heading bug in just a moment, and then we'll fly heading after waypoint Mike India Quebec. So overall I have to say the workload on the CRJ is a fair bit higher than it would be on something like an Airbus or a Boeing, with that lack of auto throttle and the lack of a proper VNAV, but I do think it makes the aircraft good fun to fly. It certainly adds to the workload. So heading bugs align, we're going to heading. Just coming up on 11,000 feet there, so we're looking good on the profile, get the descent rate coming down again. Coming back on the thrust. And we can use the magenta marker there as a really nice guidance for where we want to be at 5,000 feet. So currently that's going to put us a little bit low now, so we'll just finesse the VS there to have us roughly at 5,000 feet as we turn onto the ILS. Just coming up on 10,000 feet, so the landing lights can come on. Outside air temperature is currently minus 17, so definitely some potential icing around. We've got the engine anti-ice on, so we've catered for that. And showing about 24 miles to run now, so we'll start slowing up fairly soon. And now that we're in heading, we can select the VOR1 on the navigation display. It says Loc 1, we're already picking up the localizer, showing about 18 miles to run there. So as you can see, we're just coming up on waypoint Nebly. We're about to intercept the localizer, so we'll arm the approach. And we have Loc 1 and glide slope in white, so that's armed. Just keep the aircraft coming around so we don't have too much of an acute intercept angle. And we're showing Loc and glide slope. So the aircraft should start its turn to track in towards the runway. And we can see we are now descending to maintain the glide slope. So coming back on the thrust now that we started our descent. Maintaining 180 knots for now. Come back to around 160 at around 7 miles. So you can see the aircraft is tracking to intercept the localizer once again, so overall not too bad a job. Again, if I made that less of an acute intercept angle, I suspect it would have done just fine. There's 2,500 feet, just coming through 8 miles, take the gear down. Speed restriction for flaps 30 is 185 knots, so we'll get the speed coming back. Select 160 knots for now. A little bit fiddly. Anyway, we're below 185 knots, so we'll take flaps 30. And again, coming up on the thrust for the extra drag. And I'll bring the speed back now to VREF, which as I said today is 140 knots. And flaps 45 we can take below 170 knots, so we'll take flaps full. Again, coming up on the thrust to account for the extra drag. And we'll run the landing checklist. So flight attendants have been advised, passenger signs are on, thrust reversers are armed, landing gear is down, 3 greens, and the flaps are set for landing. Let's check we're stable. Currently showing 2 whites, 2 reds on the PAPI. Only 1 white now, but the autopilot is correcting. We are showing slightly low on the glide slope, but that does tend to be a bit of a Microsoft Flight Simulator issue, and indeed it is mentioned by Aerosoft. The aircraft does currently suffer the same issues. Disconnect the autopilot. That's checked. Still slightly low at the moment, so we'll correct.
400.
Overall the aircraft not feeling too bad to hand fly. Pretty responsive. A little bit twitchy in pitch.
300. 200.
And with 3 minimums, continue. A little bit of snow here as well, actually. Yeah, so the aircraft's a tiny bit twitchy, quite sensitive on the controls, but that may well be accurate for such a small aircraft.
20.
Flared a little bit high there, coming back off the thrust.
10.
There's touchdown. Spoilers can come up, we'll engage the reverse thrust. And we'll start braking to come off at the first high speed. Cancel the reverse. And we'll vacate to the right.
Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop.
So get rid of the
Please remain
spoilers.
seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop.
So as I say, we'll just vacate to the right, we'll make our way towards the terminal. Won't worry too much about where we're parking. So spoilers are disarmed. Landing lights can come off, as can the strobes. After landing checklist, APU, we'll start that momentarily. Get the windscreen wipers on as well. As you can see, the windscreen wipers don't have any effect. That's the same as with the default Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft. And again, the aircraft tending to slow down a little bit on me here without some thrust on. Get the flaps retracted. We'll fire up the APU, so we'll put the power and fuel supply back on. And we'll hit the start switch. So APU is coming on, transponder will leave on, slats and flaps are coming up, lights are set, and the probe heats can come off in just a second. We'll leave the engine anti-ice on for now. So there is obviously a little bit of moisture around and the outside air temperature is 0 degrees. Again, I've got quite a bit of thrust on here and the aircraft's only doing around 9 knots at the moment. As I say, we'll just make our way over towards the terminal. Park the aircraft up somewhere suitable, we'll shut the aircraft down and then I'll give you my overall impressions of the Aerosoft CRJ. Find as well, I've got a constant thrust lever position set currently. You can hear and possibly see as well that the thrust does tend to hunt up and down a little bit, which is a bit odd. Anyway, we'll just pull onto the stand here. Not going to worry too much about our parking position. And bring the aircraft to a stop. Park brake can go on. Turn the wipers off. Taxi light can come off as well. And the shutdown checklist, park brake is on. Seatbelts, well, we'll wait until we've shut down the engines to turn the seatbelts off. Thrust levers, so we'll make sure the APU is online. Which it is, so we can shut down the engines. So engines are shut down, signs can come off. As can the beacon. So thrust levers are shut off, anti-ice is off. Fuel pumps are off. Beacon is off, and the nose wheel steering can come off. And that is the shutdown checklist complete. As I say, we'll now head outside the aircraft once again. And I'll give you my overall opinions on the Aerosoft CRJ. So I hope you enjoyed our little flight from Paderborn down to Munich this morning. As usual, I'll now give you my overall opinions of the add-on. But as I mentioned during the introduction, you better brace yourself as this will be quite an in-depth discussion. Lots of topics to cover here, some of which are good, some of which are bad. I've carried out multiple flights now behind the scenes in the CRJ. So I think I've got a pretty good handle on how the aircraft performs and operates. Anyway, as usual, we'll start with the bad and work our way towards the good. We'll first start with the issues that Aerosoft themselves have highlighted with the product. I'm certainly more forgiving of issues when the developer themselves brings them up. It shows that they have at least thoroughly tested their product. And in the case of many of the issues that we'll get to in just a moment, really it comes down to limitations with the sim or the modelling techniques used with the aircraft. So in terms of the aircraft modelling, the CRJ from Aerosoft is actually the first Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft to make full use of WebAssembly. This does bring with it some advantages, however it also brings with it a few issues currently in the sim. One of the issues brought up by Aerosoft is the long loading times of the aircraft when you first load them into the simulator. This will only affect you for the first time that you load the aircraft up into the sim. Thereafter it should load normally like any other aircraft. Aerosoft do make this very clear, and they state that the process can take between 5 and 10 minutes, with the simulator being unresponsive during the course. But personally I didn't find any such issues. The aircraft loaded up much like any other aircraft that I've used in the sim. Slightly more disappointingly, however, the use of WebAssembly means there's no networking functionality currently, which means that the aircraft is unable to gather any data from a local network or the internet. And that's why, as we mentioned during the EFB breakdown, there's no opportunities to have real-world charts, weather, an en route moving map, things of that nature. This is unfortunate, but if Aerosoft are currently unable to implement this using WebAssembly, I can't hold them too much to account for that one. Also, having a fully functioning EFB is a relatively new feature in many sim aircraft. We've made do without one for many years, so I'm sure we can still make do without one in the CRJ. Another couple of little niggles: you can't assign a spoiler axis to the aircraft, as it will currently interfere too much with the spoiler logic coded into the aircraft. But you can assign a spoiler button, and again I think that's a fairly minor defect overall. Similarly, as I mentioned, my throttles didn't feel quite calibrated during the flight, but Aerosoft do provide a throttle calibration tool within the EFB, so you should be able to adjust things to your liking using said tool. Lastly, and I have to say by far my biggest bugbear, we'll touch more on this later on, but the aircraft does have some issues flying the ILS. Ultimately, according to Aerosoft, this does come back to another Microsoft Flight Simulator limitation, and certainly many other aircraft in the sim also have issues flying ILS approaches. So again, I won't hold Aerosoft too responsible for this one, but it's certainly a little bit disappointing to see. Flying an ILS approach is obviously a pretty fundamental part of any passenger jet aircraft. The last few bugs mentioned by Aerosoft, the weather and terrain radar, are not currently working on the aircraft as we mentioned. Both of these should be fixed in due course, but again it just comes down to them not having enough access to the sim data currently. And currently the aircraft has to use its own separate navigation database from the sim, which of course means it will need updating periodically. Aerosoft do provide the most current and up-to-date navigation database, but they hope in due course to use the simulator's navigation database, and therefore of course the aircraft will be updated with every iteration of the sim. That'll be really nice when it comes along, as it can be quite frustrating to use an aircraft with an out-of-date navigation database. Lastly, as you may have noticed during the approach, the rain effects currently show on the inside of the windshield. It is a little bit immersion breaking, but Aerosoft do say they should have this fixed within the coming weeks. So that just about rounds off the bugs that Aerosoft themselves are aware of. And as you can see, it is a fairly extensive list, but as I say, most of it comes down to the fact that the aircraft is rather experimental in nature and using the new WebAssembly method. So now we'll get on to the issues that I found personally with the CRJ. And I have to say that the CRJ is a really nice product, but it is marred currently by a few fairly significant issues. The main one for me, without a doubt currently, is the aircraft's autopilot. As I say, overall I did actually really enjoy flying the jet, but the autopilot at times brought me to some pretty severe levels of frustration. As we already mentioned, the aircraft is currently very haphazard when attempting to fly the ILS. I had instances where it wouldn't fly the glide slope at all, it would overshoot or undershoot the localizer, and on occasion it would capture the glide slope and then just dive towards the ground. Again, it sounds like much of what's causing this issue is actually Microsoft Flight Simulator coding itself. But nonetheless, as a user, it does make operating the aircraft very frustrating, and flying an ILS in a civilian jet is very much a bread and butter procedure. It wasn't only flying the ILS though where I found issues with the autopilot. At times, altitude capture and hold was also giving me issues. The aircraft would often hunt around to capture the altitude quite significantly, and as we saw during the video, at certain points the aircraft was losing or gaining a couple of 100 feet, up to 300 feet during certain turns. Again, I have no real world experience with the CRJ or its autopilot, but I highly suspect that that is not realistic. And lastly, when the aircraft is following the FMS routing, if there are any sharp turns during the route, the aircraft will tend to overshoot the turn and then hunt around to regain its track. Again, this is not a problem specific to the Aerosoft CRJ, I've seen it with many other Microsoft Flight Simulator aircraft. So next, coming on to the flight model. As I say, in many ways the aircraft is actually a really pleasant experience to fly, but I do still have some reservations about the flight modelling. I think some of these occur due to issues with the aircraft's loading and centre of gravity. We'll touch more on that in a moment. But in terms of my questions around the flight model, and again prefacing this with the fact that I've not flown the CRJ in the real world. So firstly, during the takeoff, the wing, as we noticed, was really picked up by the wind. It was only 10 knots of wind and I was using full right aileron to correct. We also needed almost full left rudder to account for the crosswind there. I highly suspect that that's a little bit overdone. Just having had a quick look at Google, the maximum demonstrator crosswind for the CRJ is 27 knots. And whilst that is a little bit on the low side, I wouldn't expect the aircraft to be affected quite so significantly by 10 knots of crosswind. Next, we noticed that during the takeoff, the nose actually came up of its own accord at VR. Again, I highly suspect that this is not realistic to the aircraft. And again, I think this is a loading and CFG issue, as I've had it on certain takeoffs and not on others. At approach speeds, I found the aircraft to be quite sensitive on the controls. This I wouldn't necessarily expect is unrealistic, given that the aircraft is quite a light jet. But I found that in pitch the aircraft was oscillating quite a bit, as you will have seen during the approach. And overall, I can't quite put my finger on it, but something didn't feel quite right there. Similarly, I was finding it tricky to fly an approach without at some point triggering a GPWS warning, as you would have seen during the video. And I also wouldn't expect the GPWS to trigger quite so readily. At least on the Airbus, the aircraft will actually account for the fact that you're high on the glide slope and move the warning envelope accordingly. As I say though, I think that many of these issues all come down to one common factor. I haven't managed to fully confirm it yet, but I think using the EFB performance tool actually causes issues with the aircraft's weight and centre of gravity, as that would certainly account for a lot of the issues with the flight model that we've discussed so far. Overall though, once you get the aircraft in the air, it actually feels quite nice to fly. Finally, in terms of frame rate, generally speaking, compared with something like the default 747 or the fly-by-wire A320, you'll find that the Aerosoft CRJ is about 7 FPS heavier than those two aircraft. So although we have spent quite a bit of time talking about the negative points of the product, there is also plenty of positive things that I have to say about the Aerosoft CRJ. Even with the aircraft's current issues, which I would like to reiterate once again, many of which come from the source code of Microsoft Flight Simulator, the CRJ is still hands down the absolute best, most in-depth and highest fidelity jet aircraft currently available for the sim. The moniker of study level is something that always pops up when talking about these sorts of products. And as I mentioned previously, study level is something that's quite hard to define, as I think every single individual has their own definition. Aerosoft, with their previous commercial airliner add-ons, have always been very upfront about the level of systems modelling and fidelity that they expect to provide for an aircraft. Generally speaking, the aircraft modelling and systems fidelity is designed to allow you to operate within a normal day-to-day operational regime. So that was very much what I was expecting from the CRJ. I have to say though, overall I was very pleasantly surprised and my expectations were certainly surpassed with the CRJ. As I mentioned throughout the review, I was really impressed with the level of systems depth. And a few autopilot issues aside, I was also really impressed with the level of fidelity in the flight management system as well. Certainly every switch and every control that we needed to operate the flight today seemed to be operable, and the aircraft system seemed to behave accordingly with all the correct ICAS messages there as well. So I would say that the Aerosoft CRJ is certainly approaching, if not study level, in terms of its systems fidelity. In terms of the aircraft's flight modelling, of course we've already raised some issues there. But as I did touch on briefly, once you get the aircraft in the air, it's actually a very pleasant aircraft to fly. Again, the fact that the aircraft has no auto throttle or integrated VNAV system means that not only is it quite a handful and quite a high workload to operate, but again it makes it much more interesting, much more hands-on than your average Boeing or Airbus aircraft. In terms of the visual modelling, as I said, from the outside the aircraft looks very nice. It's certainly a very decent effort at modelling the CRJ. But the real icing on the cake of the CRJ is without a doubt the cockpit. Again, the modelling, the texturing, the functionality and the overall ambience of the flight deck is right up there as one of the very best add-ons available within this price bracket. As far as the aircraft sounds go, I thought that they were done very nicely both internally and externally, with only a very few minor exceptions. And Aerosoft are absolutely to be applauded for the amount of documentation that they provided with the aircraft. It is without doubt the most comprehensive documentation that I've seen in a Microsoft Flight Simulator add-on to date, providing not only a typical user manual, but also a product manual and a tutorial guide, as well as the very extensive checklist provided within the aircraft's EFB. Similarly, although the EFB did have its issues loading the aircraft currently, I'm sure that'll be fixed in due course, and again, overall it's really nice to see that Aerosoft took the time to create such features. In summary, the Aerosoft CRJ is a really nice, very well-rounded product. It does have a couple of issues that certainly aren't trivial, but for the most part these can be worked around for now, and hopefully they will be addressed by Aerosoft in the future. I really enjoyed my time out in the aircraft, and I'm certainly looking forward to flying it again very soon. As I say, the aircraft is currently the most comprehensive jet airliner that we have available to us in Microsoft Flight Simulator, and it goes a long way to moving the sim in the right direction. The product is great fun, I really enjoyed my time out in it, and I would say that for its asking price it's currently one of the best in class. Aerosoft and Asobo have apparently been working very closely together on the project, so that should give both sides the best possible opportunity to hopefully address the issues that we've discussed here today. And if those issues are ironed out, then I could see the CRJ being an aircraft that I would happily fly for many years to come. Anyway guys, as always, thank you very much for watching. I do hope that you enjoyed the video and found it to be of use. If you did, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. If you have any comments or questions for me regarding the product, please leave them down in the comments section below, and I'll always do my best to answer them. But for now, thanks very much, and I'll see you all again soon.